Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson Today. We're listening to the new detectives. This is Dead in the Water.
An elderly woman is pulled from the murky waters of a rural pond in Alabama. A few scraps of evidence are all investigators have to link her to her killer. In Texas, the body of a woman swept away in a flash flood is found downstream. Can forensic scientists wash away deception and find proof of murder? A car crash on a country road in Wisconsin claims a woman's life. Detectives must wade through ambiguous evidence to prove her death was no accident. Once, water could dissolve evidence linking murderers to their crimes. But today, scientists can look beneath the surface for proof of homicide, even when the victims are found dead in the water. Grand Bay, Alabama, May 21st, 1994. Two teenagers floating on a pond, known locally as Blue Hole, noticed something floating in the water. As they approached, they realized it was a human body. They fled the scene and alerted their parents, who called the police. When the Mobile County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene, they recovered the body of an elderly woman. It was clear that this was not an accidental drowning. The victim had a tire jack chained around her waist, and her hands had been removed. As investigators began documenting the scene, detectives contacted the sheriff's department for a missing persons check. They hoped a search of NCIC, a database containing descriptions of people reported missing, could help them identify the victim. Sergeant Harold Bolster explains.
All missing person reports or missing persons are placed on the NCIC, and we look for any local matches, anything close to Mobile or Moss Point, Pascagoula, anything in the general region that might match up to what we had.
Only one name fit the description of the victim. 85-year-old Irma Williams had been reported missing the day before in nearby Moss Point, Mississippi. Dispatchers contacted Detective John J. Gaffney, who was investigating that disappearance.
And they advised that the Mobile County Sheriff's Office had discovered a body in Grand Bay, Alabama, which is the next jurisdiction over from us, and that they believed the body was could possibly be my missing person.
Detectives from the Moss Point, Mississippi Police Department were dispatched to the scene. After getting a detailed description of the victim from deputies, the detectives believed they had found Irma Williams. It appeared that their missing persons case was now a homicide. Investigators began searching the surrounding area for any evidence that would help them identify the killer. But a large amount of trash and debris had collected at the pond. Determining what was evidence and what wasn't would be difficult. As investigators scoured the area near the water's edge, they found fresh tire tracks imprinted in the sand. Unsure if these tracks had been left by the killer, plaster casts were made. As the search of the area continued, detectives noticed a cigarette butt with a flattened end hidden among some overgrowth. Unlike most of the trash in the area, it didn't appear to have been there very long. It was collected and sent to the lab for further analysis. Though investigators believed that the victim was Irma Williams, they needed a positive identification. They contacted her relatives. James and Sharon Williams confirmed that the victim was James's grandmother, Irma Williams.
I know this is hard, but I'm gonna have to ask you a question.
James told the officer he and his wife were very close to Irma. He described her as a vivacious woman who loved life and her family. Though her husband of more than 50 years had recently passed away, his estate had allowed her to remain independent. But James said that his father, Henderson Williams, was not close with Irma. In fact, Sharon added that Henderson hadn't seemed very worried when she told him no one could locate his mother. Sharon said she'd gone to Henderson's house around 11 p.m. the night before and found him burning trash in the yard. When told his mother was missing, Henderson seemed distracted and unconcerned. He was preoccupied by the fire the entire time. Despite Henderson's lack of concern, Sharon and James could not imagine that he was involved in his own mother's murder. The autopsy on Irma Williams was performed by Dr. J.C. Upshaw Downs, the chief medical examiner for the state of Alabama. The official cause of death was listed as severe blunt force trauma to the head. Irma Williams had died well before being placed in the pond. And for Dr. Downs, the manner in which the victim's hands were removed was also telling.
This was a clean cut, obviously a sharp instrument like a knife or a razor had been used. There was no hemorrhage or bleeding into the soft tissues. That told me that these were post-mortem injuries. And from that information, it became apparent that somebody was trying to obscure her identity.
By going to such great lengths to hide the victim's identity, investigators were confident the killer was someone close to her. They went to Irma's residence to search for answers. On a section of vinyl flooring in Irma's kitchen, investigators found reddish-brown stains that appeared to be blood. A plastic bag recovered from underneath the sink also looked blood-stained. Convinced they had found the murder scene, investigators continued searching for evidence of homicide. On the table, they noticed an ashtray full of cigarette butts. The ends of the filters were flattened, just like the one recovered from the crime scene.
I had observed an ashtray that had a lot of cigarette butts in it with a real distinctive bite mark on them. I questioned the family about these cigarette butts, and they advised that it was their father's cigarette butts, that he had a real distinctive way he bit on the filter.
Now, detectives wanted to speak to Irma's son, Henderson Williams. When they arrived at his home, he wasn't there. As they prepared to leave, investigators noticed a woman leaving the trailer on Henderson's property. She identified herself as Brenda Rowell. She rented the trailer from Henderson Williams. Though she stated that she and Henderson were close, she was unaware that Irma had been murdered. Investigators sensed that the news made Brenda uneasy. more questions. Detectives asked Brenda if she'd seen anything unusual at Henderson's place recently. She mentioned seeing Henderson washing his car the day before. He'd scrubbed it inside and out, even the trunk. Brenda thought it was odd that Henderson would suddenly take such pride in the old car's appearance. The investigator showed her a picture of the tire jack recovered from Irma's body. Brenda was surprised. It looked like hers. She said she had lent it to Henderson recently, but he had not returned it. Investigators turned their focus toward Henderson's relationship with his mother.
She's a very sweet lady.
Brenda said that Henderson and Irma had been arguing over money from his father's estate. Irma felt her son was greedy and lazy and decided to cut him out of her will and deny him access to money left to her by his father. Henderson became irate. In fact, Brenda admitted that a few weeks back, she and Henderson had a bitter argument. Henderson wanted her to sign Irma's name on checks he had taken from his mother. Brenda was reluctant to do it, but Henderson threatened to evict her from the trailer if she didn't. She felt she had no choice. She forged Irma's name on the checks. For detectives, a motive for murder was beginning to take shape. And Henderson Williams was now the prime suspect in the death of his mother. Now, investigators needed to prove it. To corroborate Brenda Rowell's story, detectives contacted the manager of Irma's bank. Not only did she confirm Brenda's account, she said that just before Irma's death, Irma had filed forgery charges against her son. Though the information didn't prove murder, it was enough for investigators to obtain a search warrant for Henderson's property. Police waited until Henderson was away from his residence before executing the warrant. An inspection of Henderson's vehicle revealed the presence of small reddish stains on a rear tail light and larger stains on the trunk's carpet. All of the samples were collected and sent to the state crime lab for further analysis. Investigators also took inked impressions of the car's tires to compare to those recovered at the pond. As the search of Henderson's property continued, investigators located the burn file described earlier by Sharon Williams. Sifting through the rubble, they found several small bone fragments. Mindful that the victim's hands had been removed and never found, investigators collected the remains. All of the evidence was pointing to Henderson Williams as the killer. But until investigators could physically link him to the murder, he would remain a free man. Police in Alabama and Mississippi struggled to solve the murder of 85-year-old Irma Williams, found floating in a local fishing pond. Though the circumstantial evidence pointed to her son, Henderson Williams, as the killer, investigators had no physical evidence tying him to the murder. Items collected from a search of Henderson's property were sent to the Alabama Department of Forensic Science. Medical examiner Dr. J.C. Upshaw Downs started with bone fragments found in the burn pile.
We were concerned at the time, since her hands had been removed, that those potentially could have been bones from Ms. Williams' hands. So they were examined by our anthropologist and also examined for DNA in order to determine if they were human, and if they were human, were they Ms. Williams. It turned out that they were non-human remains.
Still, examiners had other items recovered from Henderson's property. Serologist Elaine Scott analyzed stains taken from the trunk liner of Henderson's vehicle to determine if they were of human origin. Tetramethylbenzidine, a chemical that reacts to protein in human blood by turning it blue, is applied to the swabs. The initial screener confirmed the stains found in Henderson's trunk were human blood. Scott then repeated the process on the stains found on items from the victim's kitchen. They too were of human origin. Now, examiners needed to determine the source of the blood. DNA testing was performed on all of the samples. After extracting and isolating specific genetic characteristics in each sample, examiners determined the blood found in the victim's kitchen was genetically consistent with the blood found in Henderson's car. When those results were compared to DNA samples taken from Irma Williams at autopsy, the results were indisputable.
The blood stains in this case were at the house and placed the victim bleeding in the house, and also they placed the victim bleeding on the car.
Though the evidence was powerful, it was not ironclad. To make their case, investigators needed to physically link Henderson Williams to the crime scene. And there was one piece of evidence that had to be tested. The cigarette butt found at the pond. With only microscopic traces of saliva to work with, examiners determined there was sufficient DNA in the cigarette butt to perform the analysis. Elaine Scott then compared those results to DNA taken from other cigarette butts known to be Henderson's.
The saliva did give us a DNA profile that matched to Mr. Williams, indicating that he had smoked the cigarette at the crime scene.
The information was enough to arrest Henderson Williams for the murder of his 85-year-old mother. In custody, Henderson maintained his innocence, claiming he hadn't been near the pond in recent days. But all of the forensic evidence suggested otherwise. Investigators had matched the tire tread impression recovered at the scene to a tire on Henderson's car. Police believe that Henderson Williams' anger raged out of control when his mother cut him off from his father's estate. Investigators believe that Henderson Williams went to his mother's home, where he beat her to death. He then removed her hands, hoping to prevent identification, then placed her body in the pond. In April 1996, Henderson Williams stood trial for the murder of his mother, Irma Williams. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. In Alabama, there was no doubt that a woman pulled from a small pond had been murdered. But in Texas, police would have to wade through the evidence to determine whether a woman's death was an accident or murder. In this story, some of the names have been changed. Fort Worth, Texas, May 3rd, 1987. Francis and Jesus de la Rosa were settling in for the evening when they heard screams outside their suburban home. A man, soaking wet and distraught, stumbled inside. He pleaded for them to call 911. He said his car had been swept away in a flash flood and his girlfriend was missing. The Fort Worth Fire Department's Swift Water Rescue Team received the call. For them, these emergencies were becoming all too familiar. Torrential rains had pounded the Fort Worth area during the previous month, destroying property and worse. According to Fire Captain Richard Ward, many people had lost their lives while attempting to drive through flash floods.
The people are on their way to wherever, and they decide to try to cross the water or cross the road where the water's going, and they get swept downstream because just looking at it, they can't tell how deep the water is, and they always underestimate how powerful the water is.
This night, 2 people had made that mistake, and now one of them was missing. The rescue team searched the area near the bridge crossing where the car had been swept away. Divers scoured below the creek surface for any signs of the missing woman or the vehicle. But after several hours of exhaustive searching, rescuers found nothing. As the search continued, police questioned the driver, 40-year-old Domingo Turo, a Cuban immigrant who spoke broken English. Turo told police he had tried to drive through the water on the road. Detective Mike Garvin reviewed Turo's statement.
He didn't realize how swift the water was. He tried to back up, and it was too late. It started washing him off into the creek, and that he tried to get out and was in fact able to, he and the victim both, to get out of the car.
Turo told police that he grabbed his girlfriend, 20-year-old Janice Walters, as the car filled with water and went tumbling downstream in the currents. But the raging water broke his grasp, and she was lost. As the floodwaters began to recede several hours later, searchers were finally able to locate Turo's car. It was carried more than a mile from the crossing before being washed up on an embankment. Police retrieved the vehicle, but there was no sign of Janice Walters.
We performed a search around the vehicle, thinking that she might have stayed close to the vehicle whenever it was swept off the roadway. Our search around the vehicle and in the vehicle didn't turn up anything.
Rescuers continued looking for her, but with each passing hour, hopes of finding her unharmed grew dimmer. The search continued into the following day. Around noon, searchers discovered a body washed up on the shoreline. The woman matched Janice's description. The lifeless body, nude except for a small chain necklace, was found a mile and a half from the spot where the vehicle had been swept away. It seemed that the violent Texas storms had claimed another life. Rescue workers in Fort Worth, Texas, believed that they had recovered the body of 20-year-old Janice Walters, killed when the car she and her boyfriend, Domingo Turo, were driving got swept away in a flash flood. Authorities contacted Turo and Janice's sister, Kelly Hill, and asked them to identify the body. Kelly confirmed that her sister had been found. Investigators noticed that she seemed distant and cold toward Domingo Turo. In a statement taken later that day, Kelly confirmed that no one in her family was happy about Janice's relationship with Turo. Janice's body was transported to the Tarrant County morgue to undergo an autopsy. Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Nizam Irwani was immediately struck by the condition of the body.
One of the strange things that we discovered at the autopsy was that the body was totally nude, and the story given to us was that she was wearing a blouse and a pair of blue jeans. In 20 years' time, I've never seen a case where the body has been totally disrobed.
And a necklace still clasped around the victim's neck had inexplicably remained intact, though there were numerous other injuries in the same area. Dr. Kirwani also noted the lack of telltale signs usually associated with drowning victims.
In most cases of drowning, one sees purging of frothy fluid, which is usually blood-tinged, and this comes out from the nostrils and the mouth, and it's also present in the trachea and the bronchioles. And this frothy fluid is due to admixing of air and water which is being inhaled in a person who is drowning. We didn't see such frothy fluid anywhere.
That meant there was no water in the victim's lungs. Janice Walters had not died of drowning. As Dr. Kirwani struggled to make sense of his findings, he examined injuries found on the victim's neck. He noticed what appeared to be curvilinear abrasions, injuries typically caused by a victim's fingernails in a struggle to break a stranglehold. None of Janice's injuries were consistent with a drowning death. Dr. Kirwani stopped the examination and contacted Fort Worth police. He wanted to be certain that he had not misunderstood the circumstances surrounding Janice's death. But investigators had no reason to believe that her death was anything but a tragic accident. And the tragedy didn't end with Janice's death alone. As Dr. Kirwani proceeded with the internal examination, he discovered that she was in the early stages of pregnancy. The examination held one last surprise. There were deep hemorrhages of the muscles in the victim's neck. For Dr. Kirwani, there was only one way to explain all of the injuries.
We were not able to show any water in the lung, no frothy fluid, no blood-tinged fluid in the trachea or the bronchial tree. So the negative findings of lungs as well as the positive findings of the neck were consistent with the manual strangulation.
Dr. Kirwani's routine post-mortem examination had uncovered a homicide. After reviewing the autopsy results, Detective Mike Garvin wanted to speak with Janice's boyfriend, Domingo Turo. To overcome any confusion caused by the language barrier, he enlisted a translator for the interview. Turo claimed that recently his relationship with Janice had been rocky. But on the night she died, they had reconciled and were looking forward to starting over. He said he and Janice were returning from dinner shortly after 9 p.m. He started crossing the low-water bridge when a flash flood swept the car into the creek. He struggled to keep the car from being swept downstream. But as the car began to fill with water, he panicked, stating he may have grabbed Janice by the neck to keep her from drowning. But ultimately, the powerful currents tore them apart and she was lost. If Turo had grabbed Janice by the neck, it seemed unlikely that the thin gold chain necklace would have remained intact. Dr. Kirwani's findings, coupled with Turo's statements, led investigators to suspect that he had murdered Janice Walters. But so far, they had no real physical evidence to prove it. Investigators in Fort Worth, Texas, believe that the death of 20-year-old Janice Walters was a deliberate act of murder. And her boyfriend, Domingo Turo was the prime suspect. But police had little physical evidence and no motive to make their case. Detective Mike Garvin reviewed statements made by Janice's sister, Kelly Hill. Kelly described Janice as a warm young woman, full of fun, who'd always been very close to her family. She was excited at the prospect of being a mother. But Turo, the father of the unborn child, had become abusive and didn't want the responsibilities that came with having a baby. For the sake of her unborn child, Janice had no choice but to end the relationship with Turo. She moved home to be with her family. But Kelly stated that Turo refused to let her out of his life. A few days before Janice died, Turo called the house and they argued bitterly. Kelly stated she listened to the conversation on another extension. Turo threatened to kill Janice if she left him. Convinced that Turo had followed through on his threat, investigators still needed proof. They pored over Turo's statement, looking for any clue they may have overlooked. They found one. Turo said that he and Janice were returning from dinner when they were caught in the flash flood. Looking over maps of the area, detectives realized the couple had been heading in the wrong direction on a dead-end street. Paul Dixon, Assistant District Attorney for Tarrant County, explains the importance of the discovery.
The neighborhood used that dead-end area as sort of an illegal dumping ground. Old mattresses, old tires, trash, that sort of thing. The police had informed us that from time to time, a body would be recovered from that place.
For investigators, it was now clear that Turo was on his way to the dump to dispose of Janice's body. With his story discredited, detectives now had enough evidence to arrest Domingo Turo for the capital murder of Janice Walters. Police believe that when Janice returned to Turo's home to pick up her belongings, his possessiveness, inflamed by Janice's rejection of him, exploded into violence. After killing her, he removed her clothes and then tried to hide her body, along with any trace of the crime.
He traveled across the low-water bridge, through the rainstorm, through the flood, and nature intervened and kept him from getting to his goal.
Domingo Turo was tried and convicted for the murder of Janice Walters. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison.
Forensic science was very important because without Dr. Pirwani being able to do the autopsy and prove that it was a strangulation, we wouldn't have had a case, even though no matter how much the family thought probably that he had done something foul, we would have had no proof of it at all.
In Texas, forensic science exposed a murderer who tried to submerge evidence of his crime in a flash flood. But in Wisconsin, it took an attentive forensic pathologist to recognize a homicide disguised as an accident. Berlin, Wisconsin, August 22, 1990. A blasting company employee was locking up for the day when he heard someone screaming for help. A man, covered in mud, said he'd just been in a car accident and his ex-wife was unconscious. After calling 911, the two rushed back to the scene. Within minutes, the Green Lake County Sheriff's Department and Berlin Emergency Medical Units arrived. They found a white car in a water-filled ditch resting against a muddy embankment.
Come on, get one of you guys in here. Let's go.
A woman, face down in the ditch, was pulled from the water. Emergency technicians who rushed to her aid discovered that she wasn't breathing. They immediately began critical life-saving procedures, including CPR, to resuscitate her. The efforts paid off. The victim began breathing on her own. Barely clinging to life, she was rushed to the hospital. As the ambulance pulled away, police took a brief statement from the other accident victim. He identified himself as Daniel Egan, and the woman as his ex-wife, Darlene. He said she'd swerved suddenly to avoid a deer, and the car plunged into the ditch. Egan told deputies he'd gone for help and returned to find Darlene face down in the water. Darlene was taken to the emergency room at Berlin Memorial Hospital, where doctors fought to save her life. A Green Lake County deputy met Darlene's family at the hospital. As he was explaining details of the accident, a doctor came and told them Darlene had not survived her injuries. The family was devastated by the news, and they couldn't understand why Darlene was with her ex-husband. Sheriff's Deputy Ron Cliff explains.
When I informed them that Dan Egan was a passenger in the vehicle that had gone off the roadway, the family indicated to me that because of the rather stormy relationship that they had, that it wasn't likely that she would allow Dan Egan to be in her vehicle.
The deputy contacted investigators at the scene and passed along the information. Wisconsin state troopers began their routine accident reconstruction. By measuring the angle and dimensions of the tire marks left on the road, investigators estimated that the car had been traveling at approximately 29 miles per hour, slightly under the speed limit. But the marks left on the pavement were not the result of braking. They were the result of a deliberate high-speed turn. According to State Trooper Dennis McConnell, that fact was unusual.
An operator in a vehicle faced with a hazard such as a deer, almost 99% of the time, the first driver reaction to that hazard is to step on the brakes. And there was no indication of braking whatsoever.
The findings were enough for investigators to request that a thorough forensic examination be performed on the vehicle. The car was towed to the police impound lot. The hospital pathologist performed an autopsy on Darlene Egan. From the amount of water in her lungs, the official cause of death was ruled a drowning. But something about the victim's condition was troubling. There was an excessive amount of mud found under her eyes and in her nose and ears. The coroner requested that Darlene Egan's body be re-examined by a forensic pathologist. That evening, evidence technicians began processing the vehicle for clues. They noted the condition of the seatbelt. It was stretched over the steering wheel, still in the buckled position. Technicians also observed a lot of mud plastered on the front of the car. That wasn't unusual, but a closer inspection of the bumper revealed a hair embedded in the mud. Not knowing its significance, the hair was collected and sent to the lab for further analysis. examiners would later determine that the hair did not belong to Darlene Egan. Investigators interviewed Dan Egan the following day. They wanted a moment-by-moment account of the accident. Dan said he and Darlene were going to his mother's house to pick up their 2 children when the accident occurred. Egan told police his ex-wife suddenly yelled, "Deer," and swerved hard to the right off the road. The next thing he remembered was the car in the water-filled ditch. Darlene was unresponsive, slumped against the driver's door. Egan said he climbed out of the car and ran to the blasting company for help. He returned to the scene within a few minutes. He couldn't explain how Darlene ended up face down in the ditch. Maybe she'd come to, struggled out of the car, then lost consciousness again. For Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigations agent Rick Lewell, the amount of time necessary for that scenario was at odds with the facts.
We soon realized that there wasn't enough time involved for him to get out of the car, to run and get help, for her to get out of the car, for her to fall in the water and drown before he returned to the scene. So it wasn't passing the smell test. Something stunk here. Something was wrong. We had to take a lot deeper look at this entire accident.
For investigators, the circumstances surrounding Darlene Egan's tragic death were raising too many questions. They hoped the forensic pathologist could give them answers. Police in Wisconsin investigating the drowning death of Darlene Egan, killed after the car she and her ex-husband Dan were driving crashed into a ditch, suspected foul play. And Dan Egan's statements to police weren't adding up. To find answers, detectives enlisted a forensic pathologist to conduct a second autopsy. Dr. Robert Huntington III, forensic pathologist for the state of Wisconsin, was given the assignment.
When we do a forensic autopsy, we've got 3 ends in view. We want to see if we can determine a cause of death. We want to see if we can rule out other causes of death, and we want to see if that body itself can tell us anything about how that death arrived to that body.
The pathologist agreed with the original cause of death listed as drowning. But the injuries noted during the examination appeared inconsistent with injuries caused by a car crash. They looked like something else.
When we get bodies out of a motor vehicle crash, they are definitely banged up. And she wasn't that banged up. And the really disturbing feature were scratches on and around the face. Now, yes, you can get scratches in a car crash, but and some of these had a semblance to fingernail, enough to worry you.
The presence of fingernail scratches found on the victim's head suggested the car crash hadn't caused the drowning. In the final analysis, Dr. Huntington believed that Darlene Egan had been murdered.
Now, suppose somebody was holding her head under the water. Now, that might explain fingernail marks and such like that.
Dr. Huntington's analysis gave investigators insight into how Darlene Egan died. But to make a murder case against her ex-husband, they now needed to find a motive. They turned to the victim's family for answers. Her sister, Denise Krause, told police that Darlene divorced Dan Egan in 1988 after 5 years of marriage. Dan had become physically abusive, and Darlene lived in constant fear of him. but she was putting her life back together. Darlene had recently taken a job as a state police dispatcher and was a devoted mother to her 2 daughters. She had also become engaged to a police officer. Denise added that Darlene and Dan had been involved in a vicious custody battle up until the day before Darlene's death. As the elements of a motive began falling into place, police contacted Darlene's attorney in the custody dispute.
Yes, I need to talk to
She
you.
told investigators that Darlene had been granted primary custody of the children. And she confirmed that the ruling came down the day before the accident.
I want to take this opportunity to let you know that
In fact, she had met with the couple to discuss the arrangements.
it is my recommendation that this Megan have full custody.
When told of the court's ruling, Dan became irate. He also resented having to pay child support. He vowed to keep his children no matter what. Armed with this information, investigators went back to question Dan Egan. But this time as the prime suspect in his ex-wife's murder. Knowing Darlene took great pains to avoid being alone with Dan Egan, investigators wanted to know how the two ended up in Darlene's car together. Dan stated that on the day of the accident, Darlene came by his home to pick up the kids. But Dan's mother had taken the kids that day and was unable to bring them back to his house. And Dan didn't have a car to go get them himself. He admitted that Darlene was upset when she arrived and learned she'd have to pick the children up at his mother's. Darlene and Dan's mother didn't get along, so according to Dan, she asked him to go with her. He claimed that's where they were going when the accident occurred. Before they left, Egan agreed to provide investigators with a hair sample. The hair was sent to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab for analysis. Dan Egan's hair was compared to the hair found on the bumper of Darlene's car. They matched. For investigators, there seemed to be only one explanation for how his hair ended up on the bumper. And that explanation was consistent with the excessive amount of mud noted on the victim's face during autopsy.
Darlene may have pulled hair from her ex-husband while she's fighting to keep from being pushed under the water. And if she did have a handful of his head hair and she's pushed under the car, she would then grab the undercarriage of the car and try and free herself to get out from underneath the water. And in doing so, she would have transferred his head hair to the undercarriage of that car.
As Darlene struggled to save her own life, she left behind proof of murder. Investigators finally had enough evidence to arrest Dan Egan for the murder of his ex-wife. Based on the evidence, police believe that as the couple drove down the road, Dan wrenched the wheel to the right, sending the car into the ditch. Darlene, still buckled into the driver's seat, was ripped from the car. In the struggle, Darlene grabbed Dan by the hair. But he finally overpowered her, forcibly holding her head underwater until she drowned. For the first-degree murder of his ex-wife, Dan Egan was sentenced to life in prison. Once, killers could escape detection by washing away evidence of their crime. But today, advances in forensic science can bring proof of murder to the surface, even when the victims are dead in the water. Police in northern Oregon are overwhelmed by a string of brutal murders. At first glance, the cases appear unrelated, but as victims continue to surface, the investigation begins to expose a more terrifying truth. A quiet town in central California becomes the backdrop of a violent double homicide. With no witnesses and little physical evidence, investigators struggle to identify a suspect. To make their case, police must rely on determination, ingenuity, and luck. When death comes at the hands of a stranger, investigators depend on the physical evidence to make their case. Forensic science offers the only hope of justice when innocent victims are caught in a killer's deadly hand. Only 16 miles from Portland, the quiet town of Hillsboro, Oregon feels far away from the problems of big city life. But a few hours before dawn on October 9, 1992, dispatchers from the Hillsboro Police Department received a 911 call. A resident living along Cornell Road reported hearing multiple gunshots. Police arrived at the scene to find an abandoned 1966 Volkswagen Beetle pulled up onto the sidewalk. The car was riddled with bullets. Shattered glass, a purse, and traces of blood littered the front seat. Over a dozen bullet casings were scattered on the ground. In the glove compartment, police found the vehicle's registration. The car belonged to a woman named Martha Bryant. A driver's license found inside the purse also belonged to her. But Martha Bryant was nowhere to be found. As officers tried to piece together what had happened, another call came in from police dispatch. Half a mile away, witnesses reported a woman lying bleeding in the road. The officer arrived to find paramedics frantically working to save the woman's life. He recognized her from the driver's license photo. It was the owner of the Volkswagen, Martha Bryant. She had been shot twice. The emergency team rushed her to the University Hospital in Portland. After several hours of fighting for her life, 41-year-old Martha Bryant was pronounced dead. Later that morning, authorities contacted her husband. He couldn't imagine anyone wanting to harm her. He said that Martha was a dedicated midwife at the hospital where she worked. It wasn't unusual for her to be at the hospital well into the morning hours, helping families bring new life into the world. Martha Bryant just didn't seem to have any enemies. At autopsy, the medical examiner noticed signs that Martha Bryant had been sexually assaulted. A single 9mm bullet had pierced her lung. But it was an execution-style shot from a .22 caliber weapon to her right temple that killed her. slugs were removed and forwarded to the crime lab. Criminalists at the Oregon State Police Crime Lab began scouring the Volkswagen for clues.
Number 120 degrees.
Trajectory analysis showed that Martha Bryant had driven through a hail of bullets. Examiners determined that 17 rounds had pierced the car. The attack had come from two positions. From the right rear of the vehicle and from just outside the passenger window. It looked like an all-out ambush by someone determined to kill her. Next, examiners compared the bullets collected from the vehicle to those recovered from the victim. They matched. And the markings left on the bullets told investigators that a Browning 9mm handgun had probably fired them. Examiners also confirmed that the fatal shot to the victim's head had been fired from a different weapon, a .22 caliber handgun. This suggested two shooters. With no motive and no obvious suspects, Hillsborough police believed this would be a difficult case to solve. Detective Michael O'Connell of the nearby Washington County Sheriff's Department was asked to assist in the investigation.
It was extremely unusual, the extreme violent nature of it, the senseless, random nature of it. It was unlike anything that we had had, or unlike anything that had happened even in the whole Portland metropolitan area.
News of Martha Bryant's murder sent shockwaves through the community. The public came forward with dozens of tips, but they all led nowhere. 2 months after the shooting, the Martha Bryant investigation ground to a halt. But Detective O'Connell refused to let this senseless murder go unsolved. Believing that Martha Bryant had been randomly targeted, O'Connell began reviewing another cold case he was working from a year earlier. That victim also seemed to have been targeted by a stranger. He began looking for signs that the two cases may be connected. On April 19, 1991, Washington County investigators were dispatched to the home of an elderly Hillsborough resident. There, they discovered 62-year-old Margaret Schmidt. She had been sexually assaulted, strangled, and then suffocated with a pillow. The only piece of evidence recovered from the scene was a man's size 8.5 Reebok sneaker print left in some spilt talcum powder. The subsequent investigation into Margaret Schmidt's murder had uncovered no solid suspects.
Margaret Schmidt had no enemies, led a very quiet lifestyle. There were no actual witnesses that night to this person sneaking into her house. Other than the shoe prints, we had nothing else to go on.
After reviewing the case file, O'Connell could find no similarities between the two murders. The MO in each was radically different. The only thing that Martha Bryant and Margaret Schmidt shared in common was that both appeared to be unlikely victims. Still, investigators at the Washington County Sheriff's Department needed to find a way to close these two investigations. And their caseload was about to increase. 2 months after Martha Bryant's murder, a passing truck driver spotted something on the side of the road. As he got closer, he realized he had found the lifeless body of a young woman. He immediately called the Washington County Sheriff's Department. Detective Scott Ryan received the call.
The information that we had at that point was not specific. The people on the scene did not know if it was the victim of a hit and run or if the body had been dumped for some other reason.
When officers arrived at the scene, they found that the victim had been shot at point-blank range from underneath her chin by a .22 caliber pistol. She had also been badly beaten and sexually assaulted. But other than the bullet used to kill her, no physical evidence was recovered. Investigators had no idea who this woman was or why she had been murdered. Hoping to identify her, the victim's fingerprints were run through the police database. They got a hit. Records indicated this victim had been charged on a minor violation a few years earlier. She was identified as 23-year-old Shantee Woodman of Portland, Oregon. Detectives interviewed Woodman's friends, but no one had any useful information. She was known as a free spirit, and everyone police spoke with liked her. Like the Margaret Schmidt and Martha Bryant investigations, the murder of Shantee Woodman quickly threatened to go cold. To keep the number of unsolved murders from growing higher, Washington County authorities organized a task force comprised of officers from area law enforcement agencies. The difference in the ages of the victims and the different MO in each murder led the team to conclude these cases were unrelated. And though a .22 caliber handgun had been used in 2 of the murders, examiners at the lab concluded they were different weapons. For the next several months, police followed hundreds of leads in each of the 3 unsolved cases. But despite their efforts, little progress was made. And then, new reports of violence began to pour in. The normally quiet community of Hillsborough seemed to be caught up in a deadly crime wave. As police in Hillsborough, Oregon struggled to keep pace with the growing number of unsolved homicides in their community, a new rash of assaults were being reported. Investigators learned that 2 elderly women had been attacked in separate incidents. Police spoke with one of the victims who was still recovering in the hospital. She said a man came to her door asking to use a phone. Once inside, he attacked her. But the woman managed to activate an alarm pendant. The assailant panicked and fled. The woman was certain that her attacker was a man who used to live in her apartment building. 30-year-old Cesar Baroni. The second victim was also able to identify Baroni as her assailant. A warrant was issued for his arrest. Investigators quickly tracked Baroni to a local bar. He was placed under arrest for the 2 assaults. Unlike the unsolved murders of Margaret Schmidt, Martha Bryant, and Shantee Woodman, it seemed the latest rash of violence would be quickly resolved. At At the weekly task force meeting, Detective O'Connell learned about Baroni and details of the recent assaults. Baroni had an extensive felony record, which included a number of assaults and rapes on elderly women. As he continued listening, Detective O'Connell realized that the MO of the recent assault bore striking similarities to one of the unsolved murders. That of 62-year-old Margaret Schmidt.
Right away, we're speculating, could he be responsible, at the very least, for the murder of Margaret Schmidt, because of the age of these victims that survived and the fact that the one victim lived only a block away from Margaret Schmidt.
Though it was only a hunch that the cases may be connected, detectives interviewed Baroni in jail. He claimed he had never heard of Margaret Schmidt and denied any involvement in the recent assaults on the elderly women. Having been positively identified, investigators were convinced that Baroni was lying. Looking for any useful information, they asked him if he owned any weapons. To their surprise, he admitted to owning several. One, he said, was a Browning 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Investigators had been searching for the same type of gun in connection with the shooting death of 41-year-old midwife Martha Bryant. The hunch that Baroni was connected to the murder of Margaret Schmidt had uncovered a possible link to another unsolved case. Looking for evidence that could tie Baroni to the two murders, police obtained a warrant to search the house he shared with a roommate. The man led them to Baroni's Browning 9mm semi-automatic pistol.
We sent that gun in to be test fired and compared to the Martha Bryant ballistics evidence. But at that time, it was only a hunch. There was nothing that directly led us to believe that he killed Martha Bryant.
Police continued searching for evidence that could tie Baroni to the unsolved murders. In his bedroom, they found another potentially vital clue. A pair of Reebok tennis shoes. The same type of shoe that had left the print at the Margaret Schmidt crime scene. At the crime lab, examiners analyzed the shoes recovered from Baroni's house. They were determined to be Reebok ERS tennis shoes, size 8.5. Examiners overlaid Baroni's shoes onto transparencies of the print lifted from Margaret Schmidt's house. The unique characteristics present on the treads of Baroni's shoes were identical to those found at the crime scene. Examiners concluded that Baroni's shoe had left the print. Speculating that they had inadvertently exposed a serial killer, investigators turned to the gun recovered from Baroni's house, the one suspected in the shooting of Martha Bryant. Criminalist Chris Johnson fired the Browning 9mm weapon into a water recovery tank. Under a comparison microscope, the samples were compared to the 9mm bullets recovered from Martha Bryant's lung and from her Volkswagen. Detective O'Connell was contacted and given the results of the analysis.
Chris Johnson test fired that Browning 9mm pistol and determined that that gun and that gun alone had fired those bullets removed from her Volkswagen and had ejected those casings found along Cornell Road, to the exclusion of any other gun in the universe. It was an absolute solid positive match.
Though it was powerful evidence, it didn't prove that Baroni fired the fatal shot, which had come from a different weapon, a .22 caliber pistol. As police searched for that gun, they got a break. An inmate locked up with Baroni came forward. The inmate said Baroni had been bragging about the murder of Martha Bryant. Baroni told the inmate that he was the lone gunman. He had used the 9mm to shoot up the victim's Volkswagen and then the .22 to deliver the fatal blow. And that wasn't all. Baroni had bragged that he and another man had committed yet another murder several months before that had remained unsolved. The details of that homicide also sounded familiar to investigators. Detective Scott Ryan reviewed the inmate's statements.
One of the cases that Mr. Baroni had described to the inmate was a case of a female who was picked up in Portland, transported out west, and raped and murdered. There was only one case that could be consistent with, and that was the death of Shanti Elise Woodman.
The investigations into three seemingly unrelated homicides were converging, exposing a trail of murder that led to one serial killer. Now, police needed to find hard evidence to make sure that Cesar Baroni would never be free to kill again. Having conclusively tied suspected serial killer Cesar Baroni to the unsolved murder of Margaret Schmidt, police in Hillsboro, Oregon now sought to link him to the murders of 41-year-old Martha Bryant and 23-year-old Shanti Woodman. Baroni's alleged accomplice in the Woodman murder was tracked down to a local jail where he was serving time on an unrelated charge. At first, Leonard Darcell was uncooperative, but after being confronted with the inmate's testimony, he decided to talk. Darcell told the detectives that he and Baroni had met Shanti Woodman in a Portland bar the night she was killed. They conned her into Baroni's car. Once inside, Baroni beat and raped her. Then they drove her to a remote location. Darcell told police he begged Baroni to just leave her alive by the highway. But Baroni shot her anyway, using a .22 caliber pistol. Though police were getting close to making their case, they needed to find the weapons used in the Martha Bryant and Shanti Woodman murders. In the course of interviews with Baroni's acquaintances, the police learned that he had scattered guns all over town, leaving many with ex-girlfriends. Police tracked down and collected several of these weapons, including a number of .22 caliber pistols. The weapons were forwarded to Chris Johnson at the Oregon State Police Crime Lab. Before the test firing, however, Johnson decided to first swab the barrel of one of the weapons that was consistent with the gun used to kill Martha Bryant.
We knew that the head wound to Martha Bryant was a contact near contact, and that with a gunshot wound you can get high velocity blood spatter. We swabbed the outside of the barrel and the inside of the barrel first before we test fired to check for back spatter. We were able to find blood inside the barrel.
DNA testing showed the blood on the inside of the gun barrel was consistent with blood recovered at autopsy from murder victim Martha Bryant. This was the link needed to prove that Baroni's gun delivered the fatal head wound. Examiners at the crime lab were also able to conclusively tie another of Baroni's .22 caliber guns to the murder of Shanti Woodman. In all, Oregon authorities had linked serial killer Cesar Baroni to 3 unsolved murders. Detectives marched into the Washington County Jail and charged Cesar Baroni with the murders of Margaret Schmidt, Martha Bryant, and Shanti Woodman, and also with the assaults on the 2 elderly women. Based on the evidence, police believe that Baroni constantly prowled the area, searching for vulnerable women to abduct, molest, and kill. Though he targeted elderly women, anyone who crossed his path was a potential victim.
Not only had he gone after so many elderly people that should have had some type of peace in their later years, but he performed some very terrifying attacks on some people that were just totally unsuspecting as to what a predator he really was.
Cesar Baroni stood trial for the murders of Martha Bryant, Shanti Woodman, and Margaret Schmidt. In all 3 trials, he was sentenced to death. For his involvement in the Shanti Woodman kidnapping and murder, Leonard Darcell was sentenced to 20 years without the possibility of parole. Serial killer Cesar Baroni waited until his victims were alone before attacking. Other killers strike whenever the opportunity presents itself. Atascadero is known as a small, peaceful town nestled in the foothills of California's beautiful Central Coast. But a handgun will shatter the tranquility of any town, and Atascadero is no exception. In the early morning hours of February 5th, 1987, police and paramedics were dispatched to an apartment complex. There, they discovered the body of a young woman lying on the sidewalk. She had a single gunshot wound to the left temple. The emergency team also removed a nylon stocking that had been used to gag the victim. As crime techs fanned out to search the area for evidence, police began interviewing residents of the complex. They identified the woman as their neighbor, 22-year-old Lori Rainwater. They said that they had rushed outside after hearing screams followed by several gunshots. But because of the fog, they couldn't see anything clearly. They had no idea who could have done this. As the search for clues continued, police discovered another victim at the rear of the building. He was dead, the victim of a gunshot wound to the chest and an execution-style shot to the back of the head. He had also been gagged with a stocking. Neighbors later identified him as Lori's husband, 25-year-old John Rainwater. Police made their way to the couple's apartment. There, they discovered that the bedroom was on fire. This killer had gone to great lengths to obliterate any trace of himself from the crime scene. Police in Atascadero, California continued searching for clues in the double homicide of John and Lori Rainwater. After extinguishing a fire that had been deliberately set inside the couple's apartment, police began processing the scene. Blood spatter found throughout the apartment suggested a vicious attack. No fingerprints were discovered. Police did find evidence that the murdered couple had been bound. Yards of duct tape used to bind them were recovered. They also found 2 makeshift mittens made from socks wrapped with duct tape, probably used to keep the victims from loosening their bonds. As the search continued, police noticed 2 empty jars on a table. All of the items were collected and sent to the crime lab for a closer examination. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that each of the victims had suffered deep, blunt force lacerations. There were also signs that they had been sexually assaulted. But it was a .38 caliber gunshot wound to the head that killed both John and Lori Rainwater. The recovered slugs were forwarded to the California Department of Criminal Justice Crime Lab. As examiners started processing the evidence, investigator Bill Hanley of the San Luis Obispo County DA's office began looking for leads. With no eyewitnesses to the double homicide, there were no immediate suspects to pursue.
The homicide occurred at approximately 6 a.m. It was a very foggy, dark morning, which hindered eyewitnesses' ability to see anything clearly.
With little evidence to go on, investigators turned to the victims' families for information. Mrs. Martinez, Lori Rainwater's mother, could not imagine anyone that would want the couple dead. She said that John and Lori were a happy and deeply religious couple. They worked several jobs, one of which included taking care of the apartment building for their landlords. They carefully budgeted their money. In fact, they had recently saved enough to move to a bigger apartment in order to raise a family. Mrs. Martinez said Lori had stored their savings in small glass jars. Investigators realized that those jars had been found empty. The information led investigators to theorize that robbery was the motive behind these savage murders. They hoped the evidence could tell them more. The duct tape and the empty jars believed to have contained the Rainwater savings were analyzed by latent print examiner Marty Collins. An inspection of the jars, however, revealed no signs of fingerprints. Next, Collins turned to the duct tape. But the tape was stuck together and crushed.
Once you get the tape that is stuck together, although there are ways to try and take it apart, the chance of getting latent prints is greatly diminished.
Traditional methods of locating and raising a print were unsuccessful. But Collins had one technique left to try: a dye staining process. After applying the chemical rhodamine 6G to the tape, a laser light was applied to the evidence. The The dye adheres to any latent prints present on the tape. Under the light, a small section of a fingerprint emerged. But the discovery was not that encouraging. Collins realized that this evidence could not be compared to prints already on file. The print from the tape was from high up on the tip of the finger, not on the pad of the finger, where inked prints of suspects are taken. Over the next few months, police developed several suspects. They were all brought in for questioning, but eventually fingerprint analysis eliminated all of them. For Detective Henley, it seemed that the investigation into the deaths of John and Lori Rainwater was at a standstill.
Due to the high publicity of the case, for approximately the next 2.5 months on a daily basis, up to 16, 17 hours a day, we ran down leads. These leads were from different parolees or offenders in the area to people calling up and saying that they believe that their neighbor did it, although having no really proof on it. All the leads that we had run into came up to be dead ends.
But then, on April 29, 1987, 2 months after the murders, police received a phone call from a woman who claimed to have information about the Rainwater homicides. She agreed to come in and answer questions. The informant said that she had met the Rainwaters a few days before they were murdered. While looking for an apartment, she and her boyfriend, Dennis Dwayne Webb, had spoken with them. The Rainwaters explained that they only collected rent money from the tenants for the landlord. They didn't actually rent out apartments. But while in the apartment, the informant noticed that her boyfriend was constantly glancing at the money jars on the kitchen counter. For investigators, the story hardly proved murder. But there was more. She went on to say that a week or so after meeting with the Rainwaters, she and Dennis Dwayne Webb were arrested in a drug raid. Police had collected drugs and several weapons, but failed to find a hidden .38 caliber pistol. Having followed the double murder investigation in the media, the informant knew that was the same type of gun used to kill John and Lori Rainwater. The informant was released on bail the following day. Shortly thereafter, Webb called her from jail. He wanted to talk about the hidden .38 caliber handgun.
She advised me that, at Dennis Webb's insistence, that she was to dismantle the gun, take it to the coastal area in California, and throw it off the cliff into the ocean.
The informant did as she was told. After taking the gun apart, she drove to a remote area along the coast and threw the gun over a 300-foot cliff. After months of having no solid leads, police now considered Dennis Dwayne Webb as the prime suspect in the murders of John and Lori Rainwater. But to make their case, they needed to locate the murder weapon. And after viewing the area, investigators were not optimistic.
Frankly, when I went there and noticed where she did throw it off, I thought there was little or no chance of ever recovering that weapon again.
Members of the search and rescue team from the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Department were brought out to the site. After surveying the area, the team meticulously mapped their equipment to ensure their safety, and then geared up. It was now up to them to rappel down the perilous cliff and search the beach below for the weapon believed to have been used to kill John and Lori Rainwater. As investigators in Atascadero, California, continued searching for evidence in the slayings of John and Lori Rainwater, they finally got a break. An informant admitted that at the instruction of her boyfriend, Dennis Dwayne Wade, she had thrown the murder weapon off a 300-foot cliff into the Pacific Ocean. Though finding the weapon seemed like a long shot, the search and rescue team slowly made their way down the sheer cliff. Because of the treacherous conditions, it took the two-man team nearly 3 hours to reach the bottom. Once there, they began searching for the gun. For over an hour, the search turned up nothing. But then, under some rubbish, they found what appeared to be the frame of a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. Though it was badly damaged, police believe they had found the murder weapon. The team made their way back up the cliff and turned the gun over to investigator Hammerich. For him, its value as evidence was questionable.
Looking down the barrel of this weapon, this was covered completely in rust. Frankly, I didn't think we were going to be able to get any type of ballistic help at all from this.
Police sent the gun to the California Department of Justice Crime Lab. Technicians managed to reassemble and clean the gun enough to test fire. The test-fired bullets were then compared to those recovered from John and Lori Rainwater. The markings left on the bullets as they traveled down the barrel of the gun matched in some areas, but not all. Investigators were building a good case, but they were still a long way from proving murder. Police turned to their informant for help. They wanted to try and coax Webb into a confession. They asked his girlfriend to wear a wire and record conversations with him in prison. She agreed to cooperate, despite the danger of being exposed.
I'm convinced that the informant's motivation was only to see that justice was done. At no time during the investigation did the informant ask for any leniency on any pending criminal case she had, nor did she ask for any type of reward that was out there. It was only to see that justice was done.
During their conversations, Webb made no overt references to the murders. He believed that the correctional facility recorded all conversations. But when the informant told him she was worried that police suspected him in the murders, he began talking. But he spoke in code. Police were able to break it.
For instance, when he referred to the weapon that was recovered off the coastline. He referred to that as a cat. When he would talk about killing somebody, he would talk about popping grapes. It was that kind of code that we had to decipher.
Webb assured the informant not to worry. In addition to discarding the murder weapon, he said he had made certain that none of his prints had been left behind. Though Webb's statements were incriminating, they fell short of a confession. But they were enough for investigators to obtain a warrant to search Webb's car. Underneath the driver's seat, investigators found a roll of the same type of duct tape found in the Rainwater's apartment. In the trunk, they found a receipt for the tape, stamped with the date and time, February 4th, 1987, at 8:37 p.m. The purchase of the duct tape had been made just hours before the Rainwaters were murdered. Though convinced that Webb was the killer, police still needed to physically link him to the crime scene. Because the print on the duct tape found at the scene was from high up on the finger, examiners were unable to match it to any of Webb's fingerprints already on file. But investigators were able to obtain a court order to get new prints, this time from the area high up on Webb's fingertips. Marty Collins of the Department of Justice Crime Lab performed the analysis.
With the use of a 5-power magnifying glass, I compared the photograph that I had taken of the print on the tape with the inked fingerprints of Dennis Webb, and until I found the finger that was identified and found a sufficient number of ridge characteristics to make the identification.
The analysis proved that Dennis Dwayne Webb had bound the victims with the duct tape. The information was enough for investigators to charge him with 2 counts of capital murder.
Prosecutor Hammond.
Police theorized that after seeing the money in the Rainwater's apartment, Dennis Dwayne Webb began plotting to take it from them. A few days after that chance encounter, he returned to the couple's apartment and forced his way inside. Not only did he steal their savings, he also terrorized and tortured them for hours. When the couple managed to somehow escape, Webb chased them down and murdered them in cold blood. He then set the place on fire, hoping to destroy any evidence he may have left behind. On June 20th, 1988, Dennis Dwayne Webb was convicted of burglary, robbery, and 2 counts of murder with special circumstances. During the penalty phase of the trial, Webb testified, and for the first time admitted his responsibility for the deaths of John and Lori Rainwater. After hearing his admission of guilt, the jury sentenced Dennis Dwayne Webb to death. Stranger-on-stranger homicides are among the hardest to solve. But fortunately for investigators, killers always leave clues behind.